All right, today I want to talk about what seems to be a dying art of shore fishing. And yes, it is an art form, and that is chunking bunker for striped bass. Now, this is a practice I've been doing since I was a little kid, and pretty much every season I get my biggest striper of the year by chunking bunker. It is a very effective way of targeting striped bass. So let's start from the beginning. What is bunker? Well, bunker, also known as pogie or menhaden, depending on where you're from, is a very popular bait fish in the Northeast. Here's a clip of what they actually look like. All right, I'm gonna show you the best way to cut up bunker. I'm not a professional or anything, but I do chunk a lot, so this is kind of the way I prefer to do it. First off, use scissors, ditch the bait knife. Knives are for plebs. You don't wanna be using that crap. So what I like to do, get as close to the tail as possible, get rid of that, nothing's eating that. And then you're gonna go one tail piece, two middle piece, another middle piece, three, and then you got the head. So you got 1, 2, 3, 4 chunks out. Oh, look at that blood. That's fresh bunker right there. So chunking, as the name implies, is the act of cutting this bait fish up in 3 or 4 chunks, throwing it on a hook, and sinking it down to the bottom of the ocean. Sounds simple, right? Well, it's not as easy as you might think. There's a lot of nuances when it comes to chunking, and just because you sink down a piece of bait does not guarantee you that you're gonna catch stripers in the 30, 40, or 50 pound class. So I'm gonna break down the basics of chunking and how I usually approach it. So let's talk about the setups you're going to need for chunking. It is very important to note that in Rhode Island, if you're targeting striped bass with bait, it is law that you have to use circle hooks. You cannot use J hooks. So if you're chunking, using mackerel, squid, or whatever, if your goal is to be targeting striped bass, you gotta use circle hooks. That's very important to remember. So here are the rigs I like to use while chunking. And when I'm out in the water, I like to keep things as simple as possible. The less moving parts, the better. So all it is really is here's an 8/0 circle hook. This is tied to an 80-pound fluorocarbon leader, which is then tied to a barrel swivel, which I tie to my main line, which is usually 40 or 50-pound braid while I'm chunking. This rig is actually pre-tied from Sam's Bait and Tackle. They have a bunch of these. I think you can get them for like $1 if you don't feel like tying your own. I also tie my own. It's just sometimes easier to pick them up from Sam's. Now you might be thinking to yourself, 80-pound fluorocarbon leader, that seems excessive. Well, when you're targeting striped bass that might be hitting 50 pounds, I don't think it is. Now, the reason why I go with 80 pound is I'm not worried that the fish is gonna pull so hard he's gonna break my line. That's what drag is for. What I'm really worried about are these big fish rubbing up on the rocks down there and fraying me off on the rocks. I've had countless times where we land fish like either in the 30-pound class or even the 40-pound class. They come up and the leader is totally frayed because of all the rocks down there. Now, if I was using a lighter leader like 40 or even 50 pounds, who knows? Maybe the leader would have gave out. I do not want to lose that fish of a lifetime because I had a lighter leader on and he was able to rub me off on the rocks. That is a horrible, gut-wrenching feeling losing a big fish, and I just do not want that to happen, so that's why I use 80-pound fluorocarbon leader. But before you tie your rig onto your main line, make sure you slide on a weight slide first. That will hold the weight, that will sink the whole rig down. I found that if you add the weight on directly to your braid, after a while the weight will get like beat up from the rocks down there. It can actually nick your braid. So make sure you definitely have a weight slide. All right, I have my fishing rod here to demonstrate the different kind of hits you're gonna get while chunking. Now the key to chunking is patience. Virtually every single species eats bunker. Scup, sea robin, dogfish, crabs, bluefish, you name it, they're gonna take a whack at your bait. So you wanna wait for one specific kind of hit. Now, if you're getting hits like this, you're holding your rod and you see tap, 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 small little taps like that, you wanna be ready, but do not set the hook on that. Odds are that's something small like a scup or a sea bass just pecking at your bait, but it could also be a finicky striped bass just kind of playing with your bait. So if you set the hook while you're getting these tap, 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 and it is a striper playing with it, you're just gonna rip the chunk out of its mouth and probably spook it. Now the hit you really wanna wait for while you're chunking is the big pull. You'll be holding your rod and your rod tip will literally go wow and just totally sink down. When that's happening, a big fish has your bait and is starting to swim away with it. Once you get to this point, there's a lot of tension in your line. And with these circle hooks, you don't do a typical hook set like you would a J hook. All you're gonna do is when your rod is down like that and there's tension in the line, is give your reel a crank. There's enough tension in the line where that one reel crank should just set the circle hook right in the side of his mouth. And if it's a big fish, you're gonna know it. He will immediately start peeling drag. You're not gonna be able to stop him. All right, so a pretty common question I get is what style of rod and reel I use for chunking for big striped bass. Well, for the past couple of years, my go-to shore rod, not just for chunking, for throwing plugs too, has been an Okuma rod. This is the Seadrill Surf CSX, and it's a 10-foot medium heavy. I'm having trouble showing you guys because it's 10 foot, but I'll show you the specs. Here it is. This is the Seadrill Surf from Okuma. This is a 10-foot medium heavy. And what I love about these rods, and I'm not just saying this, what I really love about these rods is they're light, but they're also really strong. And because of this, I can bomb out cast from the shore really far, but also I have a bad tendency of high sticking schoolies up from like rocks or something if I'm fishing a jetty. I have high sticked so many schoolies with this rod, and I have never had a rod tip or the top of the rod bust. And if you've seen some of my older videos, I've had some issues with that before with other rod companies. So I absolutely love these surf rods. It's my go-to for fishing blitzes, chunking, all the above. Big fan of the Seadrill Surf CSX. You definitely get your money's worth with these surf rods, and I'm probably gonna be giving away one of these bad boys later on in the season once, you know, the fish are actually back in Rhode Island. So stay tuned for that. Now, as far as reels go, I've played around with a couple different reels, but Okuma just put out a new spinning reel called the Selena. And here it is. This is a 4,000, so these things run big. This is gonna be more than capable of handling big striped bass while I'm chunking. So this is gonna be my go-to reel for chunking this season, so you'll see me putting this thing to the test. And all affiliate links in my video description for all the gear I'm gonna be using, not just in this video, but every single fishing video I post, I have the links to all the gear I'm using, so if you wanna buy it, you can buy it, and it also helps out the channel a little bit. All right, so here's the last part of this little chunking video, and it's probably the biggest obstacle that all shore fishermen face is where should I go and when I should go. So here's how I approached it when I first started chunking. If I was fishing a spot during the day with lures and I was catching schoolies and small keepers in decent numbers and semi-consistently, I would go back to that same spot either at sunset or at night and start chunking bunker. And just by doing that alone, I started catching bigger fish on a lot more consistent basis. So if you already have some background knowledge of, you know, basic spots where you can catch stripers, if you go during the sunset or nighttime with bait, I think that gives you a greater chance of catching bigger fish. That's just my opinion, but that's something that's worked really well for me. But if you guys are looking for those slobs, and I'm talking about like the 35+ pound striped bass, I have caught the majority of the fish of that caliber during the full and new moon phases at night. That just seems to be the best window where those big fish are actively feeding. And while I'm on these night fishing trips, I'm actually timing these outings with the tide. My favorite tide to fish, and again, this is just my personal preference, this is what works for me, is the beginning of the outgoing tide. So while the tide is at slack high, meaning it's at its highest point, but it hasn't started pushing out yet, I believe this is when stripers stage up and get ready to start feeding, because right when that tide starts coming out and the current is pushing all these bait and fish out, they just put on the feed bag. They're already staged up and ready to eat this bait that is gonna start to get pushed out. So I'm usually there right at slack high tide. It might be a little slow at first, but once that water starts moving, we have had nights where it's just like clockwork. Big fish after big fish after big fish. It seems to be a very productive tide, at least at spots that I fish. So I recommend giving that tide phase a shot. Well, that's pretty much it. That's just a couple of quick tips that popped into my head while I'm cooped up and going crazy during the winter time. If you're having trouble finding some big fish from the shore, give chunking a try. It's worked really well for me. It gets a bad rap from some of the lure purists, but you know what? If someone told me I could catch a 50 pounder with a piece of bologna, I'm gonna start using bologna. I like fishing with stuff that's effective. So thank you guys for watching, counting down the days until spring. I'll close the video out with a nice striper I caught while chunking bunker this year. Oh boy. I am hooked up to a good fish. Listen to that drag. This is a heavy, this is a good fish. He's way out there, dude. This thing ran to freaking Block Island. Oh boy. That's a real fish right there, man. Oh, look at the size of this thing. Oh my God. Oh man. Hooked it right in the lip. Tank. This is a real striper right here, man. I would say in the 40-inch class, really fat. I gotta let it go. Look at this thing, dude. Just a beauty. Give her a revive in here. She's gonna need a little bit. She fought really hard. It's tricky. This is the calmest spot I could find. Come on, baby. Well, I'm holding her steady. She's not getting tossed around or anything.